You're fighting in a war, and the tide has turned against your side. Your fellow knights are falling all around you, their armor no match for the enemy's arrows. But you've managed to stay alive so far. Then suddenly, right before your eyes, one of those arrows finds its mark. It pierces your visor and lodges deep within your head. Hot pain floods your entire being as the arrowhead scrapes against your brain. And then, just like that, everything goes black. You feel yourself collapsing onto the cold, hard ground. As another wave of arrows comes flying towards you. You try to move out of the way, but it's too late. You can't move at all. A searing bolt of pain rips through your leg. You look down and see the arrow shaft protruding from the front of your thigh. You let out a scream that quickly turns into a gurgle as another arrow rips into your neck. You reach up to pull it out, but your fingers come away bloody and empty. There's nothing there. You collapse onto the ground, your vision fading fast. You can still hear the sounds of battle raging around you, but they're becoming more and more distant. You don't have the strength to fight anymore. And as the darkness envelops you, you know that this is the end. But wait, this isn't the end. Because even though you might be dead, your story doesn't have to be. In today's video, we're going to be talking about what happens after you're struck by an arrow. Stay tuned until the end because we'll be looking at how long you actually have to live after being hit by an arrow to the head. How long would you survive if you were shot in the head with an arrow? Well, the first thing that we need to do is find out where the arrow landed. After all, if it landed in a non-lethal area of the head, you might survive. For example, the back of the head is much safer than the front. And if the arrow didn't penetrate the skull, you might be able to make a full recovery. However, if the arrow struck you in the forehead or the back of the neck, it would most likely go straight into your brain and kill you instantly. So first things first, we need to determine where on the head the arrow landed. Now, if the arrow managed to penetrate your skull, you would feel a tremendous amount of pain, as the shaft of the arrow would smash through your bones, causing massive damage to your brain tissue. This could result in paralysis or even death. If the arrow manages to break through the front of your skull, it's game over. However, if the arrow breaks through the back of your skull, it's not quite as bad. That's because there's a part of the brain called the cerebellum at the back of the head. It's responsible for balance and coordination, and it's not essential for life, so you could theoretically live without it. However, if the arrow broke through the front of your skull, you wouldn't be so lucky. That's because there are several vital structures in the front of the head, including the cerebrum, which is responsible for things like thinking and reasoning, and the brainstem, which controls basic life functions like breathing and the heartbeat. So if an arrow broke through the front of your skull, it would almost certainly damage one or both of these structures, causing you to die. However, if the arrow only managed to break through the back of your skull, you might be able to live for a few minutes. During those few minutes, you would probably experience some kind of paralysis. Depending on where the arrow landed, you might not be able to move your arms or legs, or you might lose the ability to speak. And if the arrow managed to damage any of the major blood vessels in your head, you could bleed out and die pretty quickly. But if somehow you were still alive, you would only have a few minutes left to live. And even if you did manage to get medical attention, there's a good chance that you would still die. That's because removing an arrow from someone's head is tricky business. If you try to remove the arrow, you could end up pushing it further into the brain or causing an infection. So it's usually best to leave the arrow where it is. Of course, this is assuming that you can even get medical attention in the first place. If you're in the middle of a battle, it's unlikely that anyone is coming to save you. So you should probably resign yourself to the fact that you're gonna die. But let's say that you were lucky. The arrow broke through the back of your skull, but it didn't damage any of your vital structures. You're still paralyzed, but you're still alive. How long would you survive? Well, it depends on whether or not you can get medical attention. If you're in the middle of nowhere and no one is coming to save you, you can expect to live for about 3 to 7 days. During that time, you would be very weak and unable to do much of anything. But if you were able to get to a hospital, you would have a much better chance of survival. Doctors would be able to remove the arrow from your head and repair any damage that it caused. And depending on the severity of your injuries, you might be able to make a full recovery. Of course, this is easier said than done. Getting from your remote location to the hospital would be easier said than done. You might have to cross battlefields, rivers, and mountains on foot. But if you were determined to survive, you would probably be able to do it. And if you were successful, you would have a much better chance of survival. However, if you were struck by an arrow to the chest, you wouldn't be so lucky. The chest is one of the most vulnerable areas of the body, and a direct hit from an arrow could be fatal. The shaft of the arrow would pierce the skin and muscle of the chest and then lodge itself in one of the lungs or heart. This would cause massive internal bleeding and almost certainly death within seconds. Even if the arrow didn't penetrate the lung or heart, it would still cause serious damage to the ribcage, which could lead to punctured lungs or broken ribs. These injuries would be painful and debilitating, but they wouldn't be immediately fatal. However, without medical attention, they would almost certainly lead to death within a few hours. If you were able to get medical attention, your chances of survival would be much higher. Doctors would be able to remove the arrow and repair any damage to your lungs or heart. But even in the best case scenario, you would be left with a large scar on your chest. How long do you have to live if you're shot in the stomach with an arrow? Well, it all depends on how severe your injuries are. If the arrow managed to puncture your stomach, you can expect to live for about 3 to 4 hours. During that time, you would experience excruciating pain and probably vomit up blood. Unless you receive medical attention, you will die within 3 to 4 hours. If the arrow didn't puncture your stomach, you would be in a lot less danger. The stomach is protected by the rib cage, so it would take a direct hit from a very powerful bow to actually puncture it. However, even a glancing blow from a sharp arrow could cause serious damage to the stomach lining, leading to internal bleeding and eventually death. If you were able to get medical attention, your chances of survival would be much higher. Doctors would be able to remove the arrow and repair any damage it caused to your stomach. But even in the best case scenario, you would be left with a large scar on your stomach. So now you know how long you have to live after being shot with an arrow in different parts of the body. If you're ever in this situation, just remember to stay calm and get to a hospital as fast as possible. With prompt medical attention, you can survive even a serious injury like being shot by an arrow. Now it's time for you to make your voice heard. The year is 1415. The place, the field of Agincourt, near the village of Audregnies, in northern France. The French are facing off against the English, and both sides are prepared to fight. But we all know how this battle goes. We've heard the story 1,000 times. The English longbowmen pick off the French nobility one by one until King Henry V himself is wounded and the French are defeated. And then, of course, there's that whole miracle of getting the king back to England alive thing. Henry was hurt, but he survived. And while there are many tales about the battle, what as you haven't been told is the story of the men who came to his aid after he was shot and the race against time to save the king's life. This is the field of Agincourt. It is here where King Henry V was wounded. I'm bringing history to life for you through this exciting new series. And today I am going to bring you the story of how the king was saved. As you can see, the tent is big enough to fit a bed in here, and it's got a door. But because they don't want people walking in and out, they have closed the door and put up these hanging things to make sure that they are not disturbed when the king comes in. So the first thing that happens is that the king is brought here. He is lying on a pallet on the ground. You might think this is weird, but this is actually the best option because it means that if he needs to be moved, he can easily be moved. So King Henry's men rush to his side as he lies bleeding on the battlefield. His royal physicians arrive, their faces filled with dread. They've never seen an arrow lodged so deep in the skull before. The air grows thick with tension as they prepare to extract the shaft, knowing that a wrong move could end the king's life. The sight of blood dripping onto Henry's royal armor does little to ease their mounting fears. Meanwhile, in the bustling tent, the battlefield surgeons open their kits, revealing an array of crude tools, forceps, Despite the gruesome task ahead, these instruments serve as beacons of hope in a grim situation. Back at the battlefield, King Henry moans in agony as the royal physicians work quickly to remove the arrow. Every second counts as they battle against time to save their monarch's life. As the surgeons work feverishly, the royal armorer carefully lays aside the king's helmet and These symbols of power and protection now seem like relics from a distant past, as Henry's life hangs in the balance. But the danger is far from over. With the king's life still hanging in the balance, the royal physicians face a race against time. As they work to extract the arrow, the battlefield surgeons must also contend with the ever-present risk of infection. Despite the unsparing efforts of the armorer, the passage of time becomes their greatest enemy. Finally, as the moon climbs higher in the night sky, the physicians successfully extract the arrow. But their ordeal is far from over. Now comes the agonizing process of stitching up the wound, a daunting task given the depth of the injury. The surgeons work tirelessly, determined to close the gaping hole in the king's head. But as they toil, the prospect of a successful outcome seems increasingly uncertain. As the physicians struggle to repair the damage, the royal armorer tends to Henry's wounds. The battlefield surgeons, working in tandem with their royal counterparts, race against the relentless march of time. But despite their Herculean efforts, the enormity of Henry's injuries takes its toll. Will their combined skills be enough to save the king's life? Or will the field of Agincourt claim another victim? Henry was brought to this tent near death, and the surgeons worked tirelessly to save him. The armorer tended to his wounds, too, making sure that everything possible was done to keep him alive. But in spite of their Herculean efforts, the enormity of Henry's injuries took its toll. Would their combined skills be enough to save the king's life? Or would the field of Agincourt claim another victim? The moon climbed higher in the night sky, casting eerie shadows across the tent as the physicians struggled to repair the damage. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they managed to stitch up the gaping hole in Henry's head. But their ordeal was far from over. Now came the agonizing process of dressing the wound, a delicate operation that could make or break the king's chances of survival. With trembling hands, they applied soothing unguents and bandages, each movement imbued with a sense of gravity. The weight of the kingdom, it seemed, rested on their shoulders. Finally, as the first rays of dawn began to peek through the tent flaps, they completed their task. Exhausted but resolute, the surgeons stepped back to survey their work. The immediate danger seemed to have passed, but they knew that this was only the beginning of a long and arduous journey towards recovery for their beloved monarch. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting a golden glow over the battlefield, Henry stirred. To the immense relief of those gathered around his bedside, he opened his eyes. But his ordeal was far from over. The coming days would be filled with pain, setbacks, and a constant struggle to keep the infection at bay. Yet as Henry regained consciousness, a glimmer of hope emerged. Against all odds, the king was alive. And so, the tale of Henry V's miraculous recovery began. Day by day, the royal physicians and surgeons monitored his progress, tending to his wounds with unwavering care. The king's men stood guard outside the tent, shielding Henry from the prying eyes and potential threats of the outside world. Meanwhile, word of the king's perilous condition spread like wildfire, galvanizing the nation and uniting them in prayer for his recovery. As the weeks turned into months, Henry slowly began to heal. The bullet wound on his head, though initially a gaping hole, gradually closed. And with it, hope for his recovery grew. The once dire prognosis gave way to cautious optimism as the king's vital signs stabilized. But the road to recovery was not an easy one. There were days when the fever raged, threatening to consume Henry and plunge the kingdom into chaos. Yet the royal physicians, drawing upon their vast knowledge of herbal remedies and surgical techniques, fought tirelessly to keep the fever at bay. Their treatments, while often painful and uncomfortable for the king, proved effective in the long run. As spring turned to summer, Henry began to emerge from his tent, albeit slowly and under the watchful eyes of his medical attendants. The fresh air and gentle sunlight did wonders for his spirits, lifting the heavy gloom that had settled over the court. The people of Agincourt, too, played their part in the king's recovery. Local farmers and villagers brought fresh produce, flowers and herbs, known for their healing properties. Throughout the ordeal, Queen Isabella, Henry's beloved wife, was a constant source of strength and comfort. She remained by his side, tending to his needs and offering solace when despair threatened to engulf him. Her unwavering devotion was a beacon of hope, reminding all who witnessed it of the indomitable spirit of the royal couple. As the summer sun blazed, Henry's health continued to improve. The memory of the Battle of Agincourt, while still raw, began to fade into the annals of history. Henry, once confined to the four walls of his tent, was now taking longer strolls around the recovering grounds, finding solace in the beauty of nature. But it was during these leisurely walks that something remarkable happened. One sunny afternoon, as Henry strolled through a grove of trees, he came across a group of children playing. Their infectious laughter and carefree joy stirred something within him, a longing for a simpler time before the battles and the bloodshed. In a moment of inspiration, or perhaps driven by an overwhelming urge to connect with his subjects, Henry did something that few would have expected. He joined the children in their games. At first, it was an awkward affair. The weight of the crown seemed to pull Henry down, making it difficult for him to fully let loose and join in the merriment. Yet as the afternoon wore on, something magical occurred. Henry, the king, shed his regal persona and became simply Henry, a man enjoying the simple pleasures of childhood. He ran, he laughed, and he played, all inhibitions and constraints forgotten. The children, sensing no difference between their king and them, accepted him wholeheartedly, embracing him as one of their own. This serendipitous encounter marked a turning point in Henry's recovery. It was as if he had rediscovered the joys of life, the importance of human connection, and the healing power of play. From that day forward, Henry made it a point to spend time with children whenever he could. He organized games and events in the castle courtyards, inviting children from all walks of life to participate. As Henry's health continued to improve, he began to fulfill his royal duties once again. But he was a changed monarch. The experience of near death and the subsequent recovery had stripped him bare, leaving him humbled and introspective. Henry's thoughts turned to the men who had saved his life, the royal physicians and surgeons. He summoned them to his court, not to reprimand or punish, but to honor and reward. Each member of the medical team received lavish gifts, a public display of the king's gratitude and admiration. More importantly, Henry initiated a series of reforms aimed at improving healthcare and medical education. He also reformed the medical curriculum, emphasizing the importance of practical training and real-world experience. As the years passed, Henry's health remained robust, a testament to the skill of the medical professionals who had nursed him back to life. The memory of the Battle of Agincourt and the subsequent recovery remained etched in the annals of history. And the tale of the surgeons who saved a king became a legend, whispered in hushed tones around campfires and in the hallowed halls of medical schools for generations to come. Henry V went on to become a legendary medieval warrior, but he may not have done so had it not been for the bravery of the surgeons who risked their reputations and their lives to save his. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking it. It really helps support the channel and allows me to continue bringing history to life for you. Also, be sure to subscribe to the channel so that you never miss an exciting episode. What would you do if an arrow was lodged deep in the king's brain? It might sound like an impossible situation, but that's exactly what these 15th century surgeons had to deal with. They gathered around the sickbed of a Scottish king in a desperate attempt to save his life. The only problem was, their methods were from the Dark Ages, and they were about to put him through hell. The year is 1488, and the Scottish King James IV has just returned home after a disastrous campaign in Ireland. He and his men had been ambushed by an Irish rebel force led by the notorious warrior Queen Granuaile O'Brien. As the Scots retreated, James had fallen off his horse and landed headfirst into a spiked wooden stockade. A sharp piece of wood had pierced his skull and embedded itself into his brain. And now, the king's life hung in the balance. As he slowly lost his mind, desperation brought the country's leading surgeons to his bedside, but they soon found themselves in fierce disagreement. Some said the arrow must come out, while others argued it was too risky. Ultimately, the decision fell to three men: John Ruthven, an experienced military surgeon; Thomas Falls, the Dean of the Chapel Royal; and Robert Wishart, a barber surgeon who had recently received his license to practice medicine. They examined the king, probing his wounds with long hooked needles and feeling for the arrowhead within his brain. All agreed that something needed to be done, but no one could agree on a solution. In the end, they summoned King James to the royal sickbed, so the three surgeons could present their ideas. One of the surgeons declared that there was only one way to save the king: to remove the arrow at all costs. But the others protested. Taking it out would undoubtedly kill him. "Beware," they warned the king, "for if we attempt to take it forth, it shall be death to you." James was desperate, though willing to risk anything to save his own life, so he allowed the procedure to go forward. And Ruthven prepared his instruments, which consisted of a sharp knife and a pair of forceps. Then he began making an incision into the king's scalp, just as the other surgeons had warned. This was no ordinary operation. As the crowd watched, James screamed in pain as Ruthven reached into the wound and grabbed the arrow shaft with the forceps. He pulled it free and held it up for all to see. The point was covered in blood and bone fragments, but it appeared to be intact. With the danger seemingly over, everyone breathed a sigh of relief, or so they thought. Within a few minutes, James had gone into convulsions. Blood poured out of the wound, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. James died right then and there. In the end, the procedure failed. And although the surgeons had tried their best, this wasn't the first time their methods had ended a patient's life. And it wouldn't be the last. But this experience changed everything because it inspired one of history's greatest medical innovations. Imagine yourself as the lone dissenting voice in a sea of stubborn colleagues. You know in your heart that you're right, but how can you convince them? That's the exact situation young physician Robert Wishart found himself in. As the rest of the surgeons celebrated having saved the king's life, Wishart felt nothing but sorrow. His friend was dead, and he knew it could have been prevented. What had happened to James wasn't because of any fault of the surgeons, but because of their tools. Their techniques were outdated and dangerous, and the equipment they used was simply too crude for such delicate work. But while everyone else saw only the failure, Wishart saw the opportunity for something new. He understood that to get the arrow out without causing fatal damage, they would need a device capable of extracting it without tearing apart the surrounding tissue. If only there was some kind of long, hollow tube that could suck it out. This wasn't Wishart's first rodeo. He'd already been performing a type of primitive tracheotomy on patients for years, inserting a long tube into their windpipes to help them breathe. But this was different. This time, he needed something more. A tube with a special tip that could reach deep inside the body and grab the arrow securely, so it could be extracted safely. Wishart was so determined to make this happen that he spent the next 6 months locked away in his workshop, inventing and refining his idea. Finally, he emerged with a device unlike anything anyone had ever seen before. It was a long, hollow tube with a screw-like tip. Wishart called it an intermission. And although it sounds simple today, back then it was pure genius. His fellow surgeons stared in disbelief when Wishart unveiled his invention. No one had ever seen anything like it before, and they weren't quite sure how to feel about it. Sure, it seemed like a clever idea in theory, but would it really work? To find out, Wishart decided to perform a demonstration on a live animal. He chose a sheep, much to the delight of the crowd, who were eager to see if the contraption would actually work. With the sheep secured and ready for surgery, Wishart put on his finest black leather gloves and picked up the instrument. He then inserted its tip into the animal's brain and screwed it in until it reached the arrow. Carefully, he then began to turn the screw, and much to everyone's surprise, the arrow came out intact. The sheep survived the ordeal, and soon after Wishart repeated the experiment on another animal, this time using a dog. Once again, the procedure was a success. Wishart had proven his invention worked, and now all he needed was permission to use it on humans. But this wouldn't be easy. Wishart was young and inexperienced. Even with his recent success, most people doubted whether he could really do this, and his fellow surgeons were skeptical about letting him operate. After all, this was a major operation. If anything went wrong, the patient could die. But Wishart was persistent, and eventually he convinced the king's advisors to let him try. On July 15, 1489, Robert Wishart stood before the king once again. This time, he wasn't presenting an autopsy. Instead, he was about to perform a miracle. Before the eyes of the entire court, he brought his invention close to the sick man and prepared to insert it into his brain. Everyone in the room was on edge, wondering if the operation would be successful. But Wishart was calm and confident. He had practiced this many times before, and he knew what he was doing. With a quick movement, he plunged the instrument into the king's brain and began turning the screw. The crowd watched with bated breath as the arrow slowly came out. Everyone in the room was cheering and celebrating. Wishart had done it. He had successfully removed the arrow from the king's brain and saved his life. Wishart's reputation was made that day, and he went on to become one of the most famous physicians in history. Meanwhile, the king recovered fully and lived for many years afterward. As for the old methods, well, they stuck around for quite a while. It wasn't until the 17th century that doctors finally stopped trepanning, or drilling a hole into the skull, and replaced it with more effective treatments. But despite the fact that his invention saved countless lives, Wishart never forgot the first time he used it. The sight of the king lying on the table, the cheers of the crowd, and the satisfaction of knowing that he had made a difference in the world. Those were the moments that made him realize why he had become a doctor in the first place. Now watch how surgeons in the Middle Ages were horrible at their jobs. The year is 1867 in St. Petersburg, Russia. The time is late at night and a knock echoes through the workshop, followed by a shaky voice calling out, "They're coming." This young physician drops his tools and hides under a table just as a group of men burst through the door, ripping everything from the walls, tossing tools aside and storming through the rooms. They're looking for something or perhaps someone. But what are they after? And why does this physician have such a deep connection to them? Let's find out. In front of him lies a piece of metal that has been heated to a red-hot glow. With a pair of tongs, he pulls it towards him and shapes it with a heavy hammer. It's an oddly shaped piece, a bit like a syringe without its plunger. His next step involves creating a small hole in the base. With a punch and a chisel, he drives it in, then uses a file to smooth the edges. As he continues working, bits of metal shavings fall to the floor, creating a shower of sparks around him. Occasionally, the tip of the metal glows brightly, catching the light and making it seem as if stars are falling to earth. He stops to sharpen the end of the metal piece, painstakingly twisting and turning it until it looks like a sharp needle. His eyes are focused, unwavering in their intensity. Once satisfied with his handiwork, he places the finished product to one side. Next, he heats up some solder and adds it to the joint where the two pieces meet. With a final flourish, he attaches the second part, completing the device. He steps back to admire his creation. It's a syringe, but not as we know it today. It's much simpler, lacking the rubber bulb and piston that we're used to. But, in its way, it's just as revolutionary. But who is this man, and why did he spend all night forging this device? What's his story? Why do those searching earlier think he was involved in some kind of rebellion? What was he trying to invent? To understand what Vasily was doing, we must first travel back to the beginning. Our story begins, not in Russia, but across the sea in London, in the year 1853. Doctors are fascinated by something called hypodermic medication. In layman's terms, this is injecting medicine straight into a patient's veins. This was far from the first time that doctors had injected substances into patients. But there was something different about this procedure. Today, we're familiar with all kinds of injections. Doctors use them to treat infections, prevent pain, and help people maintain good health. But back then, the idea of injecting liquids directly into the body was still quite new. Many doctors were against the idea, believing it to be too dangerous. However, others saw great potential in it. In the early days, doctors struggled with the methods they used to inject medicines. It was incredibly difficult to push the liquid through the skin, so they needed some kind of tool to help them. One such invention was a syringe with a hollow needle connected to a detachable syringe. While this was an improvement over previous methods, it wasn't perfect. The problem was that these syringes were made of glass, which was fragile and could break easily. This not only put the doctors at risk of injury, but also meant that they couldn't carry them around easily. So when Alexander Woodall patented a design for a metallic syringe in 1853, the medical world took notice. Woodall's design featured a metal barrel with a detachable syringe. Unlike glass, metal wouldn't break as easily, making it safer for doctors to use. The detachable syringe meant that the barrel could be sterilized and reused, which was a game changer at a time when infection was a major concern. Not only that, but this innovation solved the issue of portability. Doctors could now carry the syringes with them and inject patients anywhere, anytime. Despite its success, Woodall's invention soon came under attack. Some doctors claimed that his metallic syringe caused more pain than other methods, which made it less effective. Others argued that it was simply too expensive for widespread use. In response to these criticisms, doctors began experimenting with different designs and materials. Some tried making syringes out of ivory, while others experimented with different ways of attaching the syringe to the barrel. Enter Vasily Petrovich, a Russian physician who had heard about the potential of hypodermic medication. After studying the available research, he was convinced that it was the future of medicine, but he had concerns. He knew that the syringe was supposed to be attached to the needle. But the existing patents weren't exactly clear on how this should be achieved. There were lots of designs for detachable syringes, but none of them seemed reliable enough. So he decided to solve the problem himself. With that, our story returns to the present day. Early in the morning, as the sun begins to rise, casting golden light through the window, the physician finishes his work on the syringe. It's unlike any other syringe in existence. Rather than having the syringe attached at an angle, he's managed to figure out how to attach it straight onto the needle. It might seem like a small change, but it makes the syringe much easier to load and use. He knows that this could revolutionize the way doctors deliver medicine. As dawn breaks, he steps back to admire his invention. The syringe is nothing fancy, just a simple metal device with a few parts. But in his mind, it represents a giant leap forward for medical science. Now, he just needs to show it to the world. But where could he possibly start? How would he go about sharing his invention with the rest of the medical community? It's important to note that during this period, the way we protect intellectual property is very different from today. Patents do exist, but they aren't always reliable. There isn't a formal process for registering patents, so anyone can make improvements to an existing patent and sell their version without asking permission. This means that many inventors, including Vasily, didn't bother with patents because they knew someone else could just copy their invention anyway. It's a far cry from today's highly regulated environment. Back then, it was all about getting your invention out there and letting the market forces decide its fate. However, there was a catch. During this time, Russia was in a state of turmoil. The government was unstable, and there was a lot of unrest among the population. If Vasily wanted to share his invention, he needed to be careful. He couldn't just go around showing it to people. He knew that if the government found out about his invention, they might try to take it from him, or worse, accuse him of being a traitor. So he needed a plan. He decided to join the Imperial Medical Society and submit his invention for review. This way, he could showcase his invention to a group of experts without revealing too much about himself. The catch was he had to keep his identity secret. He couldn't reveal his name or even his face. Under these conditions, he prepared his demonstration model of the syringe and presented it to the society. The members were impressed by the design, but they had one big question: who had invented it? They asked Vasily to identify himself, but he refused, sticking to his guns and maintaining his anonymity. This decision led to a bitter argument between him and the society. They wanted credit for showcasing such a brilliant invention, but Vasily was adamant. He didn't want to reveal his identity, and the society eventually gave up on convincing him. They accepted his invention, but without any fame. At this point, you might be wondering why Vasily was so determined to remain anonymous. Was he ashamed of his invention, or was there something more to the story? Well, here's where things get really interesting. You see, Vasily wasn't just a humble inventor. He was actually a political activist who had been involved in several rebellions against the government. When the authorities started cracking down on him, he realized that he needed to lay low. That's why he'd spent so much time hiding in his workshop, trying to perfect his invention. He hoped that if he could create something truly groundbreaking, he could regain some of his lost credibility and influence. Unfortunately, the Imperial Medical Society wasn't interested in giving him the recognition he wanted. They didn't care about his political views or his past. They just wanted to know who had invented the syringe so they could give them credit. But Vasily wasn't willing to compromise. He refused to reveal his identity and walked away from the society empty-handed. With his reputation at risk, Vasily knew he had to act fast. He wrote up a paper describing his invention and sent it off to a journal in France. He didn't know whether the French would appreciate his invention, but he was willing to take the risk. And then the wait began. Weeks turned into months, and still there was no response from France. Just as he began to lose hope, a letter arrived. A renowned French scientist had read his paper and wanted to meet him. Could this be the break that Vasily had been waiting for? Would the French be interested in his invention? Only time would tell. His Royal Highness, the King of England, lies on an operating table in the year 1483. An arrow protrudes from his head. and he trembles as the royal surgeon prepares to remove it. There is no anesthetic, only a sleeping draught which will make him drowsy but not entirely unconscious, so that he may still feel pain. But who shot the king? And can he survive this traumatic injury? This is a real 15th century surgical procedure with no modern medical intervention. Let's begin at the very beginning. It all started when the archer accidentally fired his bow at the king during a hunting trip in the forest. A second before, Henry VII was laughing with his companions as he took aim at a deer. Then there was a twang and a sharp intake of breath. The king felt something sting his temple, and then everything started to darken around the edges. When his men rushed to his side, he was kneeling by a tree with blood trickling down his face. They quickly placed him on a horse and carried him back to London. All the while, the king was losing consciousness. He had no idea that his life was hanging in the balance. Now, we find ourselves in the royal operating room. A four-poster bed with heavy curtains drawn around it to create some semblance of privacy. An older man in a velvet nightgown, Sir Thomas, stands by the bed holding a white cloth to the king's head. This is the royal surgeon, one of two men who have been summoned to attend to the king. Assisting him is a younger man, presumably also a surgeon, wearing a leather apron. On a nearby table are various surgical instruments, including a lancet, forceps, and a saw. But the most important tool is a hollow tube made of brass that fits snugly over the shaft of the arrow. The first thing that we notice about the king is his expression. His eyes are wide open, staring blankly ahead. Beads of sweat form on his upper lip and trickle down his chin. His nostrils flare and his mouth opens slightly, revealing his tongue, which is coated in a thin layer of saliva. This is how a human body reacts when in extreme pain. This is not an acting job or a stage production. This is what a person looks like when they are suffering. The tension in the room is palpable. Everyone knows what is at stake here, the king's life. As the surgeon prepares to extract the arrow, he makes an incision around it. This will allow him to get a better look at the wound and determine the best course of action. The tip of the lance is glistening and sharp. Now it's being held over the king's head, and the base of the arrow, which is protruding from his skull, is visible. As the tip of the lance comes into view, the king winces, and a low groan escapes his lips. He tries to speak, but no sound comes out. The surgeon begins to probe the wound gently. The tip of the lance is just visible under the skin. This must be done carefully so as not to cause any further damage. The point of the lance is now visible under the skin. The surgeon takes a deep breath and with a quick motion, plunges it into the wound. The king lets out a yell, his eyes flashing with pain. He thrashes about, trying to free himself from the restraints that hold him down. His breathing becomes more rapid, shallow, and irregular. The faces of those watching are grim. They know that there is a good chance that the king will not survive this operation. The tip of the lance has been inserted and is resting against the shaft of the arrow. The surgeon grips it firmly and with a twisting motion, begins to work it out of the wound. This is the most dangerous part of the operation. If the arrow is not removed correctly, it could cause massive bleeding and possibly death. The king writhes on the table, his body convulsing as the arrow is pulled out slowly. He screams, his voice echoing through the chamber. With the arrow out, the surgeon examines it closely. It is a simple wooden shaft with a metal point. This type of arrow is commonly used by archers throughout Europe in the late Middle Ages. The shaft itself is not particularly long, which is surprising given the size of the target. This would be a difficult shot to land accurately and cleanly without the aid of a crossbow. It is possible that the archer simply slipped and the arrow went astray, or perhaps there was a malfunction with the bow. Whatever the case, the result was a wound that nearly proved fatal. Now that the arrow has been removed, the surgeon must cauterize the wound in order to stop the bleeding. This is done by placing a hot iron on the wound. The king cries out as the hot iron is placed on his head, but he is trying to keep his composure and be strong. The burning sensation is excruciating, but he grits his teeth and bears it. The wound is searing shut and the bleeding is stopped. The surgeon removes the hot iron and examines the wound. It is healing nicely and there is no sign of infection. The next step is to dress the wound and apply a bandage. This will help to keep it clean and prevent any further complications. The surgeon uses a piece of linen cloth to cover the wound, and then he ties it in place with a bandage. The king winces as the bandage is applied, but he does not cry out. He knows that this is just part of the process and that soon it will be over. The bandage is secure and the dressing is complete. The surgeon steps back and surveys his work. He is pleased with the way that the operation went. In spite of the danger involved, he feels confident that the king will make a full recovery. The other surgeons nod their heads in agreement. They too are impressed with the outcome of the procedure. The king is alive, and that is all that matters. But the battle is not over yet. The king will need to be monitored closely for signs of infection or other complications. If anything goes wrong, the surgeons will be called back in to perform another operation. But for now, they can take a break. The king is resting comfortably and the worst is over. The next few days will be crucial for the king's recovery. If he can pull through, he will make a full recovery and be able to return to his duties. But if he develops an infection or other complications, he could die. The surgeons will visit him every day to change his bandage and monitor his progress. They are hopeful that he will make a full recovery, but they know that there is no guarantee. As the days go by, the king's condition improves. The wound is healing well, and there is no sign of infection. The surgeons are pleased with the progress, but they continue to monitor him closely. It is not until 2 weeks have passed that they are confident that he will survive. The king is able to sit up and eat solid food again. His strength is slowly returning, and he is able to walk short distances with assistance. By the time a month has passed since the operation, the king is back to his old self. The wound has healed completely, and there is no sign of any lasting damage. The surgeons are relieved and they celebrate with a feast. The king is grateful to them for saving his life, and he rewards them handsomely. And so it is that the tale of the king as great surgery is told and retold throughout England. Some say it was the best surgery ever performed. Others claim it was the worst. One thing is for sure, the king was lucky to survive. If you liked this video, please let me know in the comments. I appreciate your support. Thank you for watching. With one final twist, the arrowhead slides free from the skull. Blood bursts forth momentarily, but the king looks alive. The physicians cry out with relief. The device has worked. These cases are based on real operations and patients. But just to be clear, they are fictionalized for dramatic effect. And if you enjoy this sort of thing, then I've got good news for you. The app has arrived. It is available on iOS and Android and packed full of medically accurate mini-games that challenge your knowledge of anatomy and physiology. You can test yourself on medical topics or go head-to-head with friends and see who knows more. There are even surgical simulations where you can do virtual surgery and remove tumors, repair damaged organs, and more. We update the app regularly with new content, so there's always something fresh to learn. Thanks for watching. Now let's get to the show. Henry VIII was arguably the most powerful man in the world, but right now he was reduced to begging on his knees. It was the year of 1536, and the king had ridden out to take part in a hunting trip near the village of Windsor. When the hunt was over, he went to clean up at the local inn, and that's when disaster struck. A squire accidentally discharged his crossbow and an arrow had lodged itself into the king's face above his left eye. Bleeding profusely, Henry had collapsed and gone unconscious. He was brought back to Windsor Castle, where 4 of the country's best physicians were summoned to his aid. 4 days, they had bled him profusely, applied poultices, and set about trying to remove the arrow. But it was firmly wedged deep in the king's skull, and they couldn't get it out. Now, nearly a week later, Henry was clearly getting worse, and so his chief physician, a man named Guy Feckenham, was summoned before the king and queen. Catherine had only recently given birth to the king's son, and removing the arrow from her husband's head would surely result in his death. But if they didn't try to remove it, the infection would spread and kill them both. In those days, childbirth and battle wounds were the two leading causes of death for women, and Catherine had lost 5 children already. She was desperate to save this one, so she demanded that the arrow be removed, no matter the risk. Feckenham knew that there was very little chance of saving the king. If they could get the arrow out, they might stand a chance of saving the queen's life, but the chances were slim. Now, after days of rest, he began to prepare the king for surgery. An operation of this sort required many hands to hold back the crowds of courtiers, who would otherwise be clamoring around the king's bed. 4 strong men were selected to keep guard, and they stood watch around the clock, threatening anyone who came too close with a cudgel. The operation room was prepared, and the king was brought in on a raised dais, carried by 8 men. As he was laid down on the table, his head rested on a block of wood, and a cloth was placed over his face. Feckenham knew that the king would likely die, but he also knew that Henry was superstitious about the number 13, and so he made sure that exactly 12 physicians and surgeons were present in the operating room. The queen, along with 3 ladies-in-waiting, also crowded into the small space, making for a total of 16 people in the room when the operation began. First, the cloth was removed from the king's face, and the wound was prepped with a solution of wine and vinegar. Then, the surgeons got to work. They used a sharp knife to cut away the skin and muscles surrounding the arrow, revealing the shaft protruding from the back of the king's skull. One of the surgeons grabbed the shaft and pulled it gently outward, but it wouldn't budge. The king cried out in pain, and Catherine screamed for him to stop. But Feckenham insisted that they needed to try to remove it. "It must either be taken out or it will kill us both," he said. One of the younger surgeons suggested that they use a saw to cut the shaft off flush with the skin, but this was deemed too risky. Instead, they decided to try another method of extraction. The surgeons used a red-hot musket ball to burn away the wood shaft until they could grab onto the metal tip inside the skull. Once they had a purchase, they began to extract the arrow. But after only a few turns, the king's eyes rolled back in his head and he fainted. Feckenham knew that the king would die unless they did something quickly. The operation had been taking place during the summer months, and heat was rising through the thick, heavy clothing worn by everyone in the room. The stench of decay and blood hung heavy in the air, and the king's heart had simply stopped beating due to the heat exhaustion. Quickly, Feckenham directed the servants to bring cool cloths and wine for the king. Then he turned back to the operation. They needed to remove the arrow, but they also needed to lower the temperature in the room. At last, they were able to raise the king's body temperature, enough to bring him back around. But as they continued to pull on the arrow, he cried out again in pain, and they had to stop. At this point, Feckenham realized that they were in terrible danger. If the king died, he and all of the surgeons present would likely be put to death for failing to save him. If the arrow wasn't removed, then Catherine would almost certainly die in childbirth. Feckenham's mind raced. What could they do? He excused himself from the crowd and stepped outside for a moment, where he noticed that the water in a nearby fountain was actually quite cool. Quickly, he ran back inside and dipped a cloth in the water, then returned to the king's side. Holding the cloth against the king's forehead, he began to cool him off again. Around him, the other surgeons continued to pull on the arrow, and suddenly, there was a pop. The leaden tip of the arrow slid free of the bone, and the crowd gasped as blood spurted forth. But amazingly, the king was still alive. Relief swept through the crowd, and Catherine rushed forward to see if her husband was all right. Against all odds, the cooling cloth had saved his life, and Henry looked at the surgeons and declared, "You have done me more harm than good." And though he would never fully recover from the injury, the removal of the arrow gave Catherine's baby a better chance at life. Her son, Edward, would go on to become King of England, though he suffered from severe health problems throughout his childhood. He would live until the age of 15, dying just as his father did, with an arrow through the head. Now, this isn't a reenactment. These are actors and not the actual king, but it's close. You can tell because they forgot one very important detail. Henry VIII had an enormous head wound, probably because he had been shot in the face with a crossbow bolt. But what really killed him was the arrow that was lodged deep in his skull. It caused massive swelling and pressure inside his brain, which ultimately led to his demise. For centuries, doctors tried a variety of methods of removing arrows and other objects embedded in the skull. In ancient Rome, they might cauterize the wound with hot iron, while others recommended covering the wound with wax to seal it against infection. Of course, these methods were far from ideal, and it wasn't until modern times that we developed new ways to treat penetrating head injuries. When you get a paper cut, your body responds by sending white blood cells to the area to fight off infection. But if an arrow or bullet causes a penetrating head wound, then those infectious invaders can travel straight to the brain, which is why treating such injuries is so tricky. The brain is extremely sensitive to bacteria and other foreign substances, and even a tiny amount can cause an overwhelming infection known as meningitis. That's why the first line of treatment for penetrating head injuries is antibiotics. Doctors will often err on the side of giving too much antibiotics, rather than risking an infection. Afterward, the next concern is the physical damage to the brain. Swelling of the brain is a common complication following a penetrating head injury. If the brain swells and puts too much pressure on the skull, then it can cause a condition known as increased intracranial pressure. As the pressure rises, the brain can literally be crushed like a sponge, causing permanent damage and leading to coma or even death. Treating increased intracranial pressure is tricky, since the goal is to lower the pressure without lowering the blood pressure too much. This can be done by administering drugs, such as mannitol, which draws fluid out of the brain tissue and into the bloodstream, where it can be excreted from the body. Another method is to perform a craniotomy, which is the surgical removal of a section of the skull. This gives the brain more room to swell, which lowers the overall pressure. And once the brain has recovered, the bone flap can be reattached. Weeks later, King Henry awakens to find himself alone in his bedchamber. He sits up, disoriented at first, but then remembers what has transpired. He calls out for his physician, who enters with a squire bearing a silver tray with water and a small cloth-covered object. "I must apologize for not visiting sooner," says the physician, bowing before the king. "But I wanted to wait until I could bring you good news." He gestures with a flourish to the squire, who removes the cloth to reveal a mirror. Henry looks at it and sees that the bandage covering his head is now clean. He takes the proffered water and splashes it on his face. "Is it really over?" "I feel no pain anymore," he asks. "Indeed, Your Majesty," replies the physician, smiling warmly. "The fever has broken, and there is naught to be done now but wait for your full recovery." Relieved, as if to emphasize the doctor's words, Queen Isabella enters the chamber with their son, Prince Richard, followed by two ladies-in-waiting. "Good morning, my love," she says, rushing to Henry's side. "The entire court has been anxious to hear that you were doing well. We were hoping to come sooner, but we thought it best not to disturb you." She kisses him on the cheek. "And you are up already, my little lion heart," she says to her son, scooping him up in her arms. "Tell me, did you miss your father?" The prince nods vigorously. "I missed you too, my little bird," Henry says, returning the embrace. Then, noticing the physician, he adds, "And I must thank you for tending to my wounds so well. My crown and the realm owes you much." No, no, Your Majesty. The young man replies, bowing. It was my pleasure and duty as your physician to care for you as best I could. Indeed, the king agrees, and you have done more than well. Far better than well, my boy. In fact, I am told that your treatment of my wound was nothing short of miraculous. That, because of your actions, I shall make a full recovery where others would have surely died. He turns to the queen, who nods in confirmation. My lady heard rumors from those who served me during my illness that you had designed some sort of marvelous apparatus to remove the arrow from my skull, he says to the young man. Would you be willing to show it to me now out of curiosity? The physician blushes, embarrassed at being praised so highly, but bows his head nonetheless. As you wish, Your Majesty. It is nothing more than a simple device, but perhaps I may be permitted to demonstrate its use upon a cadaver. If you would find that interesting. The king smiles, pleased by the young man's modesty. That would be most interesting, indeed. Pray, let it be done here in this very chamber. I want to see it for myself. Henry watches with fascination as the physician explains how the device works. He sees the squire holding out a wooden board with a hole cut into the center. Another man carries a thick cloth bag over his shoulder, while a third stands ready with a pair of bellows. The young physician steps forward and uses a long hook to lift the limp arm of a cadaver onto the board. Then he signals to the man with the bag, who dumps its contents around the wound. A warm liquid immediately begins to flow from the hole in the board, carrying away the blood and brains that have filled the cavity. Amazing, breathes the king. So simple and yet so effective, adds the queen, dabbing a stray tear from her eye. What a marvel you have wrought, Simon of Burgundy, she says to the physician, turning to face him. How can we ever repay you? You have rewarded me greatly already, my lady, by granting me an audience, he replies, flushing again at the praise. But I do humbly request that if word of my actions reaches other physicians, that they not be persecuted for attempting similar treatments. Your wish is my command, Simon, the queen says, smiling. And so it came to pass that the story of Henry's miraculous recovery and the account of the ingenious treatment devised by his young physicians spread throughout Europe. Students of Salerno and Bologna, Paris and Prague eagerly examined the diagram of the trepanning attached to the letter describing the procedure. And so it came to pass that the physician named Simon of Burgundy became renowned throughout the known world for his part in the affair. Though many of his contemporaries would never know his true name, for Simon was a fictional character created for this video. The concept of trepanning, or the process of drilling a hole into the skull, can be found in various ancient cultures. The earliest evidence comes from the Neolithic age in what is today France, Switzerland, and Spain, as well as the Copper Age in what is today Iraq. Researchers believe that trepanning was likely used to treat ailments such as headaches and epilepsy. During the Middle Ages, however, the practice was largely abandoned. This was partly due to the belief that the skull was joined together by these delicate pipes called sutures. If these pipes were broken, it was believed that the body would die. In addition, the risk of infection was extremely high and often led to further complications. Despite the dangers, doctors continued to attempt trepanning throughout the Middle Ages. The most famous medieval trep was performed by a barber surgeon named John of Burgundy in 1245. John of Burgundy was a barber surgeon, which meant that he performed both surgical and non-surgical procedures. Barber surgeons were typically not allowed to bleed patients, but John of Burgundy was skilled enough to perform minor operations, such as setting broken bones and stitching up wounds. When Henry III of England was injured in battle, he was treated by a succession of monks and physicians, none of whom could successfully cure his ailment. Desperate for a solution, the king's brother offered a reward of 100 marks to anyone who could help the king. John of Burgundy stepped forward and claimed the prize. After treating the king for 3 months, He was eventually able to remove the arrowhead from Henry's skull with a pair of forceps. However, he suffered several relapses before finally recovering. This was not unusual, as many TREP patients died either during or after the procedure. In fact, only about 1 in 3 patients survived. Despite the danger, John of Burgundy performed hundreds of TREPs during his career, all without the aid of anesthesia. Today, trepanning is still used in modern medicine, but it is rare. It is typically only used when other treatments have failed and the patient has a good chance of surviving. Thanks to modern technology and advancements in medical care, the risk of infection and death has decreased dramatically. For the vast majority of patients, trepanning is now a safe and effective treatment option. If you like this video, check out another one about medieval surgery. Now, do you not forget to hit that subscribe button, so you do not miss out on any of our future videos. Thank you for watching.